Welcome to Voices in Action, a new podcast by the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living about disability in Oregon. I'm your host, Leo Alanak. Over the course of this first season, we'll cover a variety of topics related to disability justice education, speak with leaders of local advocacy organizations, and learn from one another in the process. This week will be the first of an ongoing exploration of policing and prison abolition as it relates to disability justice. While police brutality has always existed, the issue once again became the forefront of the news after the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer. Many looked to social media for educational resources on how to become better allies and understand how policing is inextricably tied with white supremacy, ableism, and settler colonial violence. As such, I've spoken to several people in various fields and organizations that aim to create a world of care, not incarceration. In this episode, I spoke with Woods and Maddie of the PDX chapter of Critical Resistance.
Hello, my name is Woods Irvin, and I am the Communications Director for Critical Resistance. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting us, Leah.
Hi, my name is Maddie. I am a member of Critical Resistance in the PDX chapter and a community mental health worker. Also super stoked about this conversation.
So to start with then, what is Critical Resistance?
Critical Resistance is a national organization that is member-led. We organize ourselves locally in chapters, and we seek to build an international movement to abolish the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. We typically organize ourselves in a variety of projects and campaigns that address the prison industrial complex in its local manifestations, given the particularities of the local character of the prison industrial complex. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. We've been around for about 23 years now.
So before we dive in deeper, you mentioned abolition and the prison industrial complex. Could you define both of those terms for us?
Sure. Critical Resistance uses these two definitions. The prison industrial complex is a term we use for the overlapping interests of government and business or industry that utilize surveillance, policing, and imprisonment to address or as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. I think that's the sort of like it in a nutshell. There are ways in which the prison industrial complex, through its reach and impact, helps maintain the authority of people who get their power through racial, economic, and other privileges. And the power is also maintained by earning huge profits for private companies that make deals with the government and utilize prisons and police forces, helping to earn political gains for tough on crime politicians. The abolition or prison industrial complex abolition, more specifically, is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. I think from where we are now, sometimes we can't imagine what abolition is going to look like. It's not just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It's also about undoing and remaking the society we live in because the prison industrial complex feeds on and maintains oppression and inequality through punishment, violence, and the control of millions of people.
So the question that I think comes up automatically for people, it's very fear-based, but it is a question of, well, what will we do without the police? How will cities or smaller towns be able to deal with crime, which is always a very vague thing, right? Like, what do you mean when you say crime? But yeah, what is kind of the response, the critical resistance kind of response to those kind of fears?
So Leo, I think you kind of alluded to it in how you're framing the question, but I think like part of the response is actually challenging like who gets to determine what crime is. As abolitionists, we're like fundamentally rejecting the concept of crime and the concept of criminality to better understand or highlight that what gets labeled as crime or criminality is different, and it serves the purpose of the status quo. So the biggest perpetrators of harm that we're really trying to target are policing and incarceration. And this is all forms of incarceration. And so this would include like forced medicalization, forced hospitalization, immigration-related policing. This is policing and surveillance in all forms. And so there are actually lots of examples of projects that are abolitionist to interrupt harm. And so there are some like medical projects, there are some mental health responses, community health clinics that are ongoing. So we're actively building up the world that we are seeking to create. I think it's important to highlight, and that we're seeking to transform the conditions that lead to harm in the first place. Because we know that the safest communities are those that have the most resources and are able to meet their needs. So that when people's needs are met, they don't need the police or to engage in survival activities, which can cause harm or be criminalized.
Yeah. I mean, I think just like to flesh out more or build on what Maddie was saying, it's like we're responding to a one-size-fits-all solution or response in the prison industrial complex with a robust ecosystem of support that people need. So that looks like housing, that looks like jobs, that looks like quality education, that looks like sort of in public space that's been invested in, that looks like public transportation, which are all, that looks like public healthcare, and like ironically, these are sites that have been increasingly over the past 40 or 50 years or so divested from, and also the like introduced prisons and policing into as a means to solve or resolve or address the crises or harm that come up from the instability caused by divesting from these places and sites of community-based resource that help to generate life.
So something that and I'm not sure if you would be able to speak on this since critical resistance is mainly focused in larger cities, but coming from more personal experience, something I've had to navigate a lot with like my small hometown and the smaller towns in Oregon with almost entirely white populations is that even, progressives feel that defunding as a means to abolish, or even defunding a little bit from the police is not necessary, as they don't see police violence occurring where they live. Do you have any kind of suggestions or thoughts to kind of challenge that mentality?
So I'll start by saying that, so the police are inherently violent. So the everyday interactions of police, the everyday job duties, those are inherently violent structures, and those are inherently violent processes. Police doing their job is violence. The inherent job and the inherent function of policing is violence. So wherever there is police violence occurring. But I think another way that I would take that question is to think about what is funded and what is underfunded in communities. And just imagining if people were able to like fund their projects, fund their dreams, whether that's like community supported agriculture or kids programs. So divesting money from the police and investing in communities and what communities want and dream and hope for. Because I think it's a process of imagining alternatives or other institutions that can take place of police and meet a community's needs that don't bring so much harm to other parts of the population. I think something also that's really important to be a part of the conversation about abolition is child welfare, that child welfare and disciplining the family, and child welfare is something that we like systems of DHS or CPS are statewide and like prominent oftentimes in like smaller towns or like not as big communities or like not as big cities. But child welfare and like policing of like structures of families is also policing. And so I think kind of just like encouraging folks to really examine how policing shows up in so many different systems.
TalkPoverty.org explains how the government spends 10 times more on foster care and adoption than reuniting families. Quote, The United States government incentivizes foster care placements and forced adoption over social support and reunification with birth families. In the United States, child welfare agencies are tasked with ensuring the health and safety of the nation's children. Each agency receives a complex web of funding from federal, state, and local sources, leaving it accountable to a hodgepodge of authorities. Although these agencies are often referred to as child protective services and considered by many as a cohesive national program, state and local agencies are only linked by a loose set of federal guidelines that provide broad definitions for child maltreatment, along with the Adoption and Safe Families Act, ASFA. This starts with the Federal Foster Care Program, Title 4E of the Social Security Act, which functions as an open-ended entitlement grant. There is no upper limit to the amount of funding that can be provided for eligible foster children each year. States receive reimbursements ranging from 50 cents to approximately 76 cents for each dollar spent on daily child care and supervision, administrative costs, training, recruitment, and data collection. But when it comes to programs that support family reunification, the budget slims. Title 4B of the Social Security Act, which governs federal reunification funding, includes a capped entitlement component and a discretionary component. So, unlike foster care funding, these dollars come with a set limit. One of the less-known sources of federal funding for child welfare programs is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. TANF is supposed to be a cash assistance program servicing low-income families with children. In reality, TANF funds can be used to support many services designed to help, quote, needy, unquote, children, including child protection agencies. The result is that many states use TANF funds to finance foster care, child welfare investigations, and adoption or guardianship payments. Considering that 3/4 of substantiated child maltreatment cases are related to neglect, which is often the result of poverty, it seems exceedingly unjust that funds supposedly intended to offset the worst effects of poverty are instead being used to finance the separation of mostly poor families. In an attempt to curtail the infamous foster care hopscotch, which leaves children whose parents have lost their rights bouncing from foster home to foster home, the government created adoption payment incentives. Adoption bounties range from $4,000 to $12,000 per child. As Wexler explained, quote, "The harder the system deems the child to place, the higher the bounty," end quote. But in order to begin collecting that money, a state must exceed the last year's number of adopted children, thus incentivizing states to permanently rehome an ever-increasing number of children each year. As can be expected, the number of adoptions increased in the 5 years after the implementation of ASFA, while reunifications declined. The Bush administration's Adoption and Promotion Act of 2003 further codified this adoption bounty system by allocating $43 million yearly to states that succeed in increasing the number of adoptions from foster care. Many states contract with private agencies that oversee out-of-home placements and service referrals for child welfare-involved parents. Said Wexler, quote, "That agency will probably be paid for each day that child remains in foster care, so the private agency has an incentive to convince itself that the child really, really can't go home and has to stay with them for a long, long time." End quote. What does this look like on the ground? Painfully delayed referrals to support services such as parenting classes and addiction treatment, judges hesitant to find fault with the way agencies and providers handle cases, and private agencies eager to deem parents unfit for reunification, end quote. And, of course, given that so many communities of color are heavily policed and kept in poverty, many children of color are removed from their families and placed into white homes. This does not even begin to cover the more than 20,000 children imprisoned by DHS at the border, who have been violently separated from their families. Many will never be able to reunite with their loved ones, as nearly 3,000 children were disappeared by the government in 2018 alone.
And I think if we're speaking about these wealthier communities who might not see the violence of policing, it doesn't mean that it's not occurring as well. So I think about migrant workers, unhoused folks, and others who might not be considered part of the quote unquote community, who are still subjected to really high rates of violence and policing. And then I think finally, I would just say to those folks that if people are hearing about the extremity of violence of policing all over the country, then it is imperative to take that seriously. Even if folks are not recognizing or seeing the violence of policing in their everyday lives, that doesn't mean that it's not occurring, and that we really do all need to take that seriously.
So a common concern, especially with the rising rate of gun violence, is mass shootings. And this also actually ties into the increased policing in schools, right? We need armed officers to deal with violence like mass shootings. What is kind of critical resistance, the abolitionist view of of dealing with the concern of mass shootings?
So I think the first way that I want to respond to that is like kind of with a question in turn, which is that what's working now with the response to mass shootings? Because it's not working. Cops do not de-escalate situations. They introduce more violence into situations. Community members are the ones who de-escalate and prevent future violence. And so I think when we're talking about gun violence, the thing that we really need to highlight is that police are the biggest perpetrators of gun violence, and that they routinely are inflicting violence, extreme violence, like constantly. So what we need to do is we need to address the root causes of these extreme amounts of explosive violence as opposed to increase policing. So we need to build up alternatives for dealing with conflict and issues rather than putting more violence into a situation. And as abolitionists, we uplift collective interventions to harm and stop harm before it starts.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that also ties into how the police will escalate mental health crises. And they will often be called in. The large majority of time, the person having the mental crisis is not about to pose a danger to themselves or others. But in the few cases where somebody may have something like a knife on them, the police only exist then with guns to escalate the situation and escalate the violence even further. So also to your point in terms of kind of the preventative element of why are these happening to begin with? Well, machine guns are horrifically easy to get access to. And then also just the unaddressed rampant white supremacy that leads to mass shootings in a lot of cases. So I appreciate your answer on that. Thank you. So the other kind of question then that kind of follows is, why don't increased police trainings or reforms work?
That's a great question. And I think the sort of straightforward answer that we give at critical resistance is because the prison industrial complex and therefore policing is not broken. And it actually does exactly what it was built and designed to do. And so technical fixes actually expand it, right? So when we try and modify around the edges and assume something small is going to get to make it function better, quote better, then we sort of kind of fall into that trap. And when we talk about something like training or body cams, that actually means that millions of taxpayer dollars are now being funneled to expand the resources of policing. And I think about even just this past period. So there's, over this last decade, we've seen more and more pressure around the violence of policing. During this past period, there was a police training that our CR Oakland chapter fought in the Bay Area that was called Urban Shield. And Urban Shield was billed as a disaster response for the entire county of Alameda, in which Oakland is housed. And so this is the disaster response, the primary federally funded disaster response program for the county is essentially an international SWAT war games police training, right? So this is a county that is prone to forest fires and the smoke that comes from the forest fires. It's a county that does not have a robust public health response, which, as we saw this last year, could have been really, really great, even internationally. But I think that this is an example of the priorities in this country, and to some degree globally, to think about, when imagining responding to crises, to only imagine a militarized response as opposed to a robust infrastructure of care. So basically, the CR Oakland chapter spent a good 4 to 5 years fighting Urban Shield and worked with public health workers as well as prior disaster response, like infrastructure, like folks who had designed the earlier Alameda County response infrastructure, that this infrastructure that had been defunded in order to build up Urban Shield, in order to shut that program down in 2018 and reroute those funds to actual like health response that can engage the emergencies that Alameda County actually has. So I think that that's just, I think, one example of the sort of shift in priority that we're trying to make for people, especially around when thinking about training.
So it sounds like then that's something that even those who, again, talking more from like a everyday citizen, not necessarily somebody who's involved in the nitty gritty of organizing and activism, but if you are kind of aware that the police cause harm, then you also need to keep an eye out for not getting sold on a line. It's kind of tricky because there's a lot of ways in which things will be sold kind of to the public as, for the community, for like, this will help everybody. And it sounds like it's very easy then to kind of get, even again, if you're well-intentioned and you know that the police cause harm, get tricked into kind of supporting these things because so much of our systems are ingrained in policing. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, I think that what is exciting and also where there's opportunity and also some, I would say, threat in this moment around defunding policing is exactly what you're saying. And I think that for folks who are maybe newer to thinking about their municipal budgets, I think that it is no accident that across the country, police oftentimes make up anywhere from a third to 70 or 80% of a municipal budget's general fund. And that as I was saying earlier, the sort of the long history of police expansion is actually a history of attempts to reform it, and to reform it from sort of more progressive direction, reform out the more unsavory parts of it. But as we're seeing, that's not in any way demilitarizing the police. And actually what's coming, I think, into public consciousness more is how we're like across the country and across the world, police violence is just inherent to policing.
I'm not sure what your thoughts, either of your thoughts are on the kind of defund the police movement versus the move to abolish the police. And again, not saying that they are completely different, because in a lot of cases it's defund as a means to abolish. But then there are also some people who are like, well, we don't want to abolish the police. We just want to lessen their budget. And so there's a lot of different nuances there politically, but since it also kind of ties into the reforms element of what's actually helping and what's causing more harm, I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
So defund the police is it does go beyond just dollars and cents. It is about it's not just about decreasing police budgets. It's about decreasing also the power, the scope, and the size of police departments. It's about delegitimizing the institutions of surveillance, the institutions of policing, and punishment overall, and of these strategies for addressing harm. So it is a strategy. It's a how, or at least from an abolitionist perspective, it's a how to advance the long-term vision of abolition of the police through divestment from policing as a practice, dismantling policing institutions, and building the community-based responses to harm that we have been talking about earlier, that don't rely on the prison industrial complex. And I think that there is a really great resource that Critical Resistance has pulled together on thinking how to think about or how to approach a reform or proposed reform or concession that you win from either a reformist or an abolitionist orientation, because we are abolitionists are very much grounded in reality, and so understand that we like that there's going to be gradual shifts in the direction that we're going in. And so that while there might be like across the country, some like collectives of people who get together who are like, I just want to reduce the amount of resources that are going to the police department. I think we like our job is to like bring those folks along, but that we understand that our ultimate goal is to abolish policing and by extension, the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, and I appreciate also what you're saying about how abolitionists are grounded in reality, because I think that it can seem like a very radical notion given the world that we live in, and therefore a dangerous or unrealistic thing. But it is really important to remember that it is grounded in so much historical advocacy work and also smaller movements that have worked over the years. It is based on both like long-term revolutionary goals and also practical steps that we can take that are radical in really fantastic ways of, hey, what if we tried to help each other out instead of harming each other? That's the ultimate kind of goal. And so wild notion, I know, but I'd like to kind of turn then and talk more about the disability justice lens and how disability justice relates to the abolition movement. Could you speak on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are infinite ways that the disability justice movement relates to the abolitionist movement. So I think that we can see that in the ways the prison industrial complex is embedded in the medical industrial complex. So we can look at locked psychiatric facilities as an example of that, forced medicalization, policing in hospitals. There's also policing of disabled or mentally ill folks that's really prominent in the child welfare system as a way of like disciplining and controlling families. I think we can also look at like policing of unhoused folks on the street. 2/3 of people murdered by the police are disabled or perceived as such. And I think that this is one of those, I think, really good moments to bring back up like resourcing communities. Like the abolitionist and disability justice lens is like, well, communities need resources. Like folks need self-control. Folks need autonomy to figure out what safety and security looks like for them. So that might be peer models of responding to mental health crises. That could be housing folks, but like giving communities the resources to figure that out for themselves. Because also like policing and the facets of the prison industrial complex like create disability. Like if we think about how prisons are built on like toxic waste sites or like forced sterilization of folks who have had contact with the child welfare system, that it's impossible to separate the logic of the PIC from ableism on like a very intrinsic and inherent level.
Can I just add that was excellent, Maddie. Can I just add also just towards the end there, the disabling of the prison industrial complex is that like the trauma of like people who are disabled cycling in and out of either locked psychiatric facilities or jails. That frequency is really high. And then also the disabling impacts of confinement, of long-term confinement, particularly solitary confinement, and what it does in terms of breaking down someone's psyche. Going back to the statement of the prison industrial complex it's designed to do what it's meant to do. Like this is how it's designed. There's like a way in which the abolitionist movement and the disability justice movement are like need to be in solidarity together in order to stop a major purveyor of disabling violence.
I just want to give a quick shout out to Project Let's and the Harriet Tubman Collective for both doing really radical disability justice work. So those would be great resources if folks are trying to like specifically learn more.
There is a long history clearly of forced sterilization within women's prisons as well. Mm-hmm. So like from the late 90s through the early 2010s, like thousands of women, most of them Black, Latino, and Indigenous, were falsely told that they had cervical cancer and needed their reproductive organs removed. And so doctors performed non-consensual hysterectomies after they gave birth. So I think there are multiple sites at which the prison industrial complex, whether it be, as you were saying, in detention facilities or within prisons or in relationship to the medical industrial complex and poor and families of color, that forced sterilization has historically been a part of that, and not, when we say historically, like recent history.
In the book Capitalism and Disability, author Marta Russell explains the intersection of the prison industrial complex and disability. Quote, "The story of disablement and the prison industrial complex must begin with a trail of telling numbers. A disproportionate number of persons incarcerated in U.S. prisons and jails are disabled. Though Census Bureau data suggests that disabled persons represent roughly 1/5 of the total population, prevalence of disability among prisoners is startlingly higher." End quote. The editor includes disability statistics from 2019. Quote, "Disabled individuals are more than twice as likely as non-disabled individuals to be the victim of violence, and those with cognitive disabilities in particular are more than 4 times as likely as those without disabilities. Percentage of people killed by police annually that have a disability or mental disorder, 50% and 25% respectively. Percentage of the over 2 million Americans incarcerated in prison or jail that have a disability by gender, male 35%, female 44.5%. Percentage of those incarcerated in state prisons who have a mental health disorder by gender, male 55%, female 73%. For more statistics on incarceration, visit prisonpolicy.org. Marta Russell continues to expand on this. Quote, "Rates of learning disability are spectacularly high among prisoners. In studies conducted among incarcerated juveniles, learning disabilities have been estimated to occur in up to 55% of youth nationwide. In one single state study, 70% of youth qualified for special education. As for mental disabilities, in California, anywhere from 1/6 to 1/4 of prisoners are believed to have diagnosable, quote, serious mental disorders," end quote. Most stunning of all is a 4-state study that examined juveniles imprisoned for capital offenses. Virtually 100% of those studied were multiply disabled, neurological impairment, psychiatric illness, cognitive deficits, having suffered serious central nervous system injuries resulting from extreme physical and sexual abuse since early childhood. Why are so many prisoners in the United States disabled? Genetic determinists like to attribute the high prevalence of disability among prisoners to inherited deficiencies. For instance, James Watson of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory holds that, quote, "We perhaps most realistically should see a person's handicap as the major origin of a social behavior that has among its many bad consequences the breeding of criminal violence," end quote. In opposition to this view, we propose the alternative approach forged by Marx, a material analysis of the economic and social forces of capitalism. The structure of capitalist America plays a central role in the life of any group, including that of people with disabilities. Given the historic segregation of disabled persons not only from American society, but from the accumulation process, disabled people living in the so-called free world have a grim commonality with their disabled compatriots behind bars. Institutions in general, including prisons, have functioned to support the accumulation of capital and the social control of surplus population, including the reserve army of unemployed left adrift by an economic system which dictates that large numbers of workers must be unemployed. The prison population is not a cross-section of America. Prisoners are poorer and considerably less likely to be employed than the rest of the population, and poverty in America is inevitably linked to a higher prevalence of disability. Neither quality health care, nor safe, adequate housing, nor nutritious food has been available to poor people. Environmental racism, the sitting of toxic waste dumps and other poison-emitting industries in low-income, mostly non-white neighborhoods has a devastating impact. Not only are poor children exposed to lead and other toxins, resulting in high rates of developmental and learning disabilities, they also drink poisoned water and breathe poisoned air, leading to extreme prevalence of asthma and other respiratory illnesses and cancers. Poor people often live in neighborhoods plagued by drug and alcohol abuse, leading to physical and psychological damage, including fetal alcohol syndrome, and marked by violent crime, leading to spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, and other disabilities. As Christian Parenti explains in Lockdown America, capitalism, the creator of poverty, simultaneously needs and is threatened by the poor. In order to manage and contain its surplus populations and poorest classes, American capitalism has developed paramilitary forms of segregation, containment, and repression. Not coincidentally, it has created the social condition we are calling disablement by excluding disabled persons from full participation in society through segregation, containment, and repression." End quote.
I think part of disciplining ability, or like the discipline of like disabled folks in like surveillance and like all of the many forms that takes, because I think it's bigger than just policing. Like I think it's
Absolutely.
bigger than just like police wearing uniforms. Like really want to highlight that. Like also very prominent in the medical system, hospitalizations, like just being really intentional about like how policing is showing up so prominently in all of the systems that are surrounding us. So I think about the connection between like surveillance and discipline and like the productive person. I think capitalism expects and profits off of a certain body, a certain type of productivity, a certain type of engaging in the world, and that disabled folks don't fit what capitalism tells us the good worker is like. And so then I think the like carceral capitalist system that we live under renders bodies disposable and renders folks disposable. And so I think that's part of the like invisibilizing that you were mentioning or kind of like alluding to, Leo. And I think I would just take that a bit further and say like, I don't think it's just invisibilizing. I think it is like the intentional disposal of folks or like subjecting them to conditions that lead to like premature death, that it's like very much part of like the carceral capitalist project.
To return to Marta Russell's writing again, quote, "Let us not be lulled into thinking that disabled persons living outside of prisons have autonomous lives. Institutional life, whether in a prison, hospital, mental institution, nursing home, or segregated school, and many receive no schooling, has been the forced historical reality, not the exception for disabled persons. Unlike race or gender, disablement is not generally thought of as the outcome of capitalist social power relations. Rather, it tends to be viewed as a matter for medicine to cure or control. Our medical and social welfare institutions have historically held disablement to be an individual problem, a personal tragedy. They blame a disabled person's inability to participate fully in the economic life of our society on their physiological, anatomical, or mental limitations rather than on economic or social forces. Disability activists and theorists, however, have laid a materialist groundwork for understanding disability oppression. If we trace how work evolved under capitalism, we can observe its effects on the disabled population. While one cannot claim that working-age disabled persons in pre-capitalist societies had achieved full integration and economic well-being, many occupied a niche in small workshops and family-based production, where they could contribute according to their ability. Early capitalism required a major shift in both the social organization of work and the concept of human labor. As human beings were gathered into the, quote, dark satanic mills, unquote, to accomplish the sacred task of capital accumulation, circumstances arose which became barriers to disabled people's survival. Disabled workers were increasingly excluded from paid employment on the grounds that they were unable to keep pace with the new, mechanized, factory-based production system. Industrial capitalism commodified the human body, creating both a class of proletarians and a class of quote-unquote disabled. Over time, it became justifiable to remove individuals with impairments from mainstream life and segregate them in a variety of institutions, including workhouses, asylums, prisons, colonies, and special schools. At the same time as it has marginalized and segregated disabled people in institutions, industrial capitalism, in its grinding push toward productivity at any cost, has caused disabling accidents and conditions to occur at an unprecedented rate. Viewed in this light, black lung, brown lung, asbestos, and a host of other deadly illnesses are the direct offspring of capitalism, along with the chilling litany of incidents in which factory workers have been paralyzed, burned, blinded, deafened, lost limbs, lost physical or mental function, or have otherwise been rendered disabled. While capitalism shunted disabled persons out of the worker pool and into institutions, the medical industry pathologized traits such as blindness, deafness, and physical and mental impairments that have naturally appeared in the human race throughout history. In the Foucaultian sense, medicalization and institutionalization became means of social control, relegating disabled persons to isolation and exclusion from society. The combination met capitalism's need for discipline and control. Michael Oliver explained, quote, "The institution is repressive in that all those who either cannot or will not conform to the norms and discipline of capitalist society can be removed from it. It is ideological in that it stands as a visible monument for all those who currently conform but may not continue to do so. If you do not behave, the institution awaits you." End quote. Institutions of all descriptions thus become formidable, formalized containment devices. It is now the disability rights movement's primary revolutionary goal to reverse this trend. The impact on disabled people of this kind of segregation has been profound. They are the least likely to be employed, the most likely to be impoverished and undereducated. Disabled persons are twice as likely not to finish high school, 22% versus 9%. A disproportionate rate of disabled persons report having inadequate access to healthcare, 28% versus 12%, or transportation, 30% versus 10%. Of course, one must acknowledge that disabled people live on the economic margins of all societies throughout the world, not merely in capitalist countries. But nowhere else are we witness to the jarring disconnect between a society's vast wealth and its refusal to provide more than the barest means of survival for its most vulnerable citizens." End quote.
And I just think about, there were, under the very patchy, admittedly messy welfare system that we had for about 50 years in this country, there were facilities for people with disabilities that were state run. And during the Reagan administration, people were expelled from them. And that's when we see this sort of like explosion of houseless people, because literally the only thing, like the state knew that that population was there, and the only reason, to some degree, they were removed, like there were two reasons. One was because clearly there was organizing, because those facilities were harmful by progressives, but then there's also the fact that at the time, and currently, there is like a liquidation of the state actually supporting robust care for people. And instead, it's not necessarily, like, as abolitionists, like we point to the fact that like we didn't have a sort of smaller state as the sort of Reagan, sort of Thatcher, like administration was calling for, but in point of fact, just ended up with a state that was around the same size and to some degree growing, but it has a more specific function, which is policing and imprisonment. And so instead of care for those people who we know are there and need care, there's just more and more policing and imprisonment to like, for the goals that Maddie was articulating so well.
The creation of an intentional system of harm, right?
So I think less care facilities, but like I think specifically about forced hospitalization, medicalization, that if people are being forcibly hospitalized, they can be medicated, even if they're not the ones requesting it, that like through the process of being forcibly hospitalized, people's autonomy is taken from them, people's ability to decide like how they're going to respond to what's going on, and that people are not permitted to leave. And so I think that is one of the ways that like policing shows up, and just forcibly hospitalizing people who don't fit into like the conventional or like capitalist like model of production, or like model of like what a worker is. So I think that also shows up a lot with folks whose perception of reality might be different from like the dominant or like more like widely accepted view of reality. Just like the assumption that like folks have to be locked up, that is the only response. And I think like that's one of the ways that like as an abolitionist, I'm like, no, like what do those folks need? Like how can we like instead set up like networks of care? Like what would meet this person's needs, rather than like locking them up in a hospital in like violent conditions and like not respecting their bodily autonomy by forcibly medicating them when they are not the ones who are like deciding what they want or their treatment plan or like what would make them feel safest. It's like the imposition of like carceral logics on people.
Marta Russell continues to expand on this. Quote, "To better understand the relationship between disability and prison, it is instructive to focus on the treatment of those who are mentally ill. In the second half of the 20th century, the dominance of the mental health institution began to decline as the capitalist economy underwent restructuring. Economic stagnation, low profits, and the fiscal crisis of the 70s were met with Reaganomics, i.e., tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, an attack on labor, deregulation of health and safety regulations, and cuts in state spending on education, welfare, and social programs, including those institutions housing people with mental illnesses. Deinstitutionalization, as it related to those who had been labeled mentally ill, was a government policy change driven by cost-cutting motives. Spending by the 50 states on treatment for people with mental illness, for instance, was lower by a third in the 90s than it was in the 50s. When the awful snake pits of neglect and abuse we called mental institutions were closed, necessary new structures and solutions, including community housing, employment services, a vital component for populations experiencing severe labor market discrimination, and other appropriate programs designed and run by disabled individuals themselves were never put in place. Instead, GOP revolutionaries of the 104th Congress, falsely blaming the deficit on the welfare state and entitlements, attacked the social safety net. The 1990s crackdown on federal disability and welfare benefits and state reductions to general relief and Medicaid further expanded the scope of damage to deinstitutionalized people who had been diagnosed with mental illness, many of whom found themselves destitute the moment they were discharged from the hospitals. Because the states had abandoned their social contract with deinstitutionalized people labeled mentally ill, many were left stranded on the streets, caught up in the revolving door between homelessness and prison. At present, an overwhelming number of jail inmates with mental illness are homeless. Increasingly, the judicial system punishes such people for their quote-unquote quality of life misdemeanors by slapping them with jail sentences. At any given moment, 40% of all Americans with serious mental illness are estimated to be in jail or prison, comprising from 10 to 30% of all inmates. The Center on Crime, Communities, and Culture concludes that in many jurisdictions, jails have become the primary treatment provider for poor people with mental illnesses. This criminalization of mental illness has its roots in the U.S. capitalist healthcare system and the growth of the prison industry. The rise of managed care, now the dominant paradigm among hospitals and physicians, has also had a debilitating effect. In the name of cost containment, payment mechanisms have shifted. Hospitals and doctors are now paid a flat fee instead of receiving payment for individual services rendered. Because of financial incentives for physicians and hospitals to keep costs low, people who have been hospitalized for mental illness are often discharged in 3 weeks, ready or not, without a discharge plan that would provide them with crucial community support. Thus, the old snake pit mental institution is being replaced with yet another institution, the prison, where incarcerated social wreckage contributes to the GDP by supporting thousands of persons associated with expanding and maintaining the prison industry. Mental health advocacy groups rightly point out that people with mental illness rarely belong in prison. Jail diversion and discharge planning, they say, are key to stopping the revolving door of repeated hospitalizations and incarcerations. They recommend ongoing community treatment and support services, all grossly underfunded now, to mend the broken system. The psychiatric social change movement, comprised of survivors of the mental health industry, is wary of solutions that may lead to forced hospitalization, involuntary psychiatric drugging, and forced electroshock, all of which have been a part of the corporate psychiatric model. The shattered mental health system has largely depended upon one or another form of incarceration and forced treatment, whether in hospitals or prisons. In their efforts to end the involuntary imprisonment of so-called mentally ill persons, grassroots social change groups are concerned that one destructive institution not be replaced with another. The focus must be on human rights, including the right to refuse treatment, empowerment, and alternatives such as community and peer support." End quote. What's interesting, though, is there's also the flip side of it then where people, not to say that what you're talking about is care at all, but kind of forced hospitalizations and forced sterilizations, forcing medications on people who may not want it. Then there's also the element of people who aren't able to get care that they do want, that they do need, that I have seen a lot, especially when I was down in LA for college, and I was in the emergency room several times, and there were so many people there who were clearly struggling with health issues, with housing issues, with safety concerns, and repeatedly over and over, I saw the cops dragging them out, kicking and screaming, because they're like, well, we can't help you for whatever reason. So the cops are going to come in and threaten you and kick you out of the hospital when you're there because you need help. And so again, it kind of goes back to that like lack of internal logic that the system has to a certain extent, not to say that it isn't intentional, but that thing of like, we're going to force care on the people who don't want it. And we're not going to help out the people who do want it.
I think one more thing that I would add, because I think that sometimes when folks think about abolition, they think about like, well, what's going to happen? Like, and it's that like folks are really actively like building these systems, building these communities, building these like networks of care. So I think about peer models to respond to crisis. So the movement of like cops have absolutely no place in like mental health crisis. And instead, like, how can we leverage like our own lived experiences, our own communities, like the networks and the relationships that we have to like uplift folks when they need it. I also think about Mia Mingus and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective and the concept of pod mapping, which is really, really cool in terms of just like, how do we as communities, like, how do we meet each other's needs? Like, how do we know what other folks want? How do we know like how to show up for each other on like a day-to-day basis? Because it's like through those processes that we are like building strong communities and really truly making police obsolete. So I think the abolitionist work is happening. It's already happening. And there's so many ways for people to like get involved and learn more. So it's not just like a future thing, like we're building it, like we're doing it now.
Why do we need police abolition? Why do we need prison abolition?
I think my simple answer is because people deserve better and communities deserve better. Like people deserve to have their needs met, to be able to flourish and thrive and dream and create and build, and like communities deserve that too. Communities deserve to be able to dream together and build together and be creative and strategic and meet their needs and grow and have it be like sustainable and long term. And that's not possible under like the logic of the prison industrial complex. And so I think it's like the process of like building in the world that we want to see to create networks of community care so that like people can get the support that they need without like the violence of policing and surveillance in all forms showing up everywhere.
I think that one thing that undergirds that is that nobody, it's something I think that like Mariam Kaba says, where like nobody comes in to harm as a perpetrator. And so when we think about like what people are concerned about, is like what abolitionists are proposing is what has been a thread going through this conversation of interrupting a cycle of addressing harm with more harm and instead replacing it with robust systems of care and support.
So how can individuals support the abolitionist movement or critical resistance's work in Portland?
I can say more like just the abolitionist movement more broadly. There's lots of projects to give resources or time to. So you could always join the CR Portland chapter, or you can start an abolitionist like group in your local area. And I know Maddie's gonna like has a whole list of formations locally that also you can give support to. I think if you are interested in giving either time or energy or resources to critical resistance, you can always check us out at criticalresistance.org. And like we're doing lots of work across our multiple chapters, fighting ICE in jails in New York and New Jersey, fighting to defund OPD in Oakland, fighting to close prisons in LA, close prisons across California from LA. And then there's like our work with our sort of inside outside work with our abolitionist newspaper, which comes out 3 times a year. We seek to give to prisoners for free. And so your donations go towards helping to produce that paper that's written both in collaboration with both folks inside and outside and goes to thousands of prisoners across the country. And then Maddie, if you want to, you have the lowdown on organizing in PDX in Oregon.
So I think in terms of supporting CRPDX's work or abolitionist struggles in Portland, so there's the Write Them All campaign to write all imprisoned folks in the state of Oregon, and then CR has for a couple years and will continue to do mail nights to write incarcerated folks. You can sign up even if it's just like 10 letters. Would love to have whoever help out with that. Follow our work on social media. And there's a bunch of like campaigns also that CR supports that are in Portland or organizations. So I'm just going to like shout some of those out. So there's the Stop the Sweeps campaign, which does really radical work of stopping sweeps of unhoused people in Portland. So then there's Don't Shoot, which is an organization that CR has partnered with a bunch of times in the past. Black and Pink that also does similar correspondence nights. So you can write incarcerated folks, LibLit, which is Liberation Literacy. Yes. And then Defense Fund PDX. And I would also say that like there's mutual aid projects that I think are like popping up all over the country, and that mutual aid projects can be a really cool way like of abolitionist praxis of like meeting folks' needs. That could be like involvement with like a free fridge or a free food pantry, or like start an abolitionist reading group with your friends, follow social media. Like there are a lot of ways to get involved. I think like abolition as a word can like strike people as like radical. I think people can like have a reaction to it, but there's an Ursula Le Guin quote that I want to read because I think it's very helpful in like conceptualizing how something is both radical and very realistic and essential. And the quote's, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." So I think abolition can seem radical. It's also very tangible and happening and real. And while she's referencing capitalism, I think it also applies to the PIC as well.
If you're interested in learning more about the transformative justice movement and how we can care for one another outside of prisons, this episode's recommended book is Beyond Survival: Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement by Ejiris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Semarasina. The link to purchase this book can be found in the episode description, or check it out and support your local library. To learn more about prison and policing abolition, check out Critical Resistance's website for educational resources and information on chapters near you. Thanks again to Woods and Maddie for speaking with me. This has been Voices in Action, a podcast brought to you by EOSIL. Stay informed, stay safe, and remember, as Mariam Kaba said, let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair.